Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're in at the moment. Eid Mubarak to everyone that has celebrated the recent Eid al-Adha in many parts of the Middle East and the larger Muslim world, and across the world, in fact. And happy holidays for those who are taking time off from work and have managed to be with us today for this installment of the ongoing dialogues on the future of work in the Global South. As most of you know, ERF has been organizing these dialogues to deal with the very important, timely, policy-relevant question affecting the future of work in the Global South. Two webinars were organized in the last 2 days. This is the third, I'm not mistaken. There is another webinar that will follow this broadcast, and so you're encouraged to tune in, and if you've missed any of them, to actually follow the YouTube channel that ERF has. Very, very briefly, on the importance of these dialogues and what they deal with, an important starting point for the discussion here is this technological revolution that is underway, has been underway for a while, and the dramatic changes and advances in ICT that we're all feeling, seeing, reading about, and they're affecting our lives, they're affecting the lives of others, and they're raising very profound economic, developmental, and also human questions about the impact of technology, the impact of these technological advances, whether they're artificial intelligence, digital-based systems. In the Global North, there seems to be a consensus, a benign consensus, or a benign neutral consensus about the impact that these technological advances are having on economies and on societies. There's a recognition that these advances are likely to contribute to innovation, will bring about some improvements in the well-being of ordinary citizens. And overall, even as far as workers are concerned, notwithstanding the fact that there will be some job losses, skills development and the ability of systems to respond will allow for workers to adopt, to complement the skills they have with these technologies, so that on net, the impact will be positive on economies, on jobs, and perhaps on prosperity at large. That's the view in the Global North that has been widely adopted across academic and policy circles. In the Global South, the story, as has been rightly articulated in the invitation to this webinar, is more nuanced, is more complex. And so there is many reasons to believe that these rapid technological changes that are underway are likely to not necessarily always lead to positive outcomes on individuals, societies, on economies, for reasons that have to do with structural issues largely. There are lags in the adoption of technology. You have systems that provide skills that are either behind or unable to cope and make the necessary adjustments. And you've got a lot of economic retardation due to the presence of informality, low-wage employment, and a host of rigidities that, while allowing technology to have a positive impact, can also have unintended and negative consequences. And so the objective of this dialogue, from the perspective of the organizers at ERF, and we need to thank them for helping to bring us together for this discussion, is to help develop exactly the kind of narrative about the Global South a narrative that is informed by research, by policy analysis, one that's accessible, that's understandable to policymakers and the general public, in order for us to think about the future of work. Now, everything I've said so far was true before COVID-19. The last 2 years, we've seen some massive economic, socioeconomic, and developmental impacts on precisely the sectors and the workers for whom the future of work matters, especially those in the informal economies, those without social protection, those on low-wage employment, their ability to adjust, to withstand, to accommodate, and the institutional responses. And this is a panel that is focusing on institutions, labor market institutions, how they are able to cope, adjust, and respond to, on the one hand, the technological changes that I've noted, but also the COVID-19 dislocation that is still taking place around the region and around the world. All of this is by way of saying that we really are happy to be engaged in this dialogue. It is going to be a dialogue, but we're fortunate to have three great speakers who will get us off and help crystallize the ideas and focus this discussion, taking on specific questions and hoping that at the end of this, the sum of the presentations you will hear, and they will be brief, they will be succinct, they will focus on specific issues, will allow us to open the floor for a broader discussion that will be productive, open-minded, and also helpful for all of us, the organizers, the sponsors, but especially the audience and the policymaking community and the public at large. We will go with the speakers as advertised in the order that has been presented. We will start with our first speaker from the ILO, Dr. Omar Rani, who's a senior economist at the ILO, the Department of Research, looking at precisely a lot of the questions affecting livelihoods, informality, low-wage employment, inequality. She's an academic, now a policy analyst and an advisor to policymakers and governments from the ILO. She will take on two important questions that will hopefully frame the rest of the discussion today. The first question, this, I hope I'm not the only one feeling a bit of ignorance in this regard, it has to do with the so-called gig economy and the digital-based and the platforms for jobs and employment that have received a lot of attention. How much of this is taking place in our region? Do we have an assessment? Do we have any stock taking that has been done? This matters for the discussion we're having. And so if Omar could help us, or Dr. Omar could help us assess the magnitude of the challenge here, the size of the gig economy and these platforms, their size, and then perhaps help respond and articulate a few ideas about their likely impact on the region and what policymakers can do to ensure that technological change would have overall a positive impact on growth and job creations and livelihoods. All of this keeping in mind that in the post-COVID world, a lot of what we're talking about has a very different meaning than would have been the case just 2 years ago if you organized this discussion. So, Dr. Omar, the floor is yours. You've got 15 to 20 minutes to articulate your ideas, and we'll look forward to listening to you.
Thank you, Tariq, and also to colleagues at ERF for inviting the ILO for this discussion and putting down some of the issues we think are very important. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending upon where you are based at the moment, and also Eid Mubarak to all. It's strange that one lives in a country like Switzerland and is completely disconnected with many of these festivals. It would have been a big thing back home in India, but here I have to keep reminding myself, yeah, it's a time of Eid where, you know, there's a part of celebration which is quite integral, but here it's quite far away. So it was very nice to hear you all exchanging these warmth with Eid Mubarak. Um, Before I get in, I think when we do talk about future of work, we do talk about a number of things. We're talking about robotization, automation, artificial intelligence, and a number of digital tools and technologies that have come up actually, which are transforming the way work is done, organized, and how even work processes take place. So what I'm going to talk about is largely on the gig economy, which is a tiny segment of this overall future of work. And within the gig economy, I think gig is something that we all know of. It's always existed in the traditional labor market. It's basically work that casual workers do on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. So this is not something very new to us in the global south or for developing countries per se. This has always existed. The reason why the notion of gig economy has come into place is because of the rise of the digital labor platforms, which is as a result of the digital technologies and the rise of the digital economy per se, because cloud computing, cloud infrastructure, and all of this has actually allowed different types of digital tools to come into the fore that allows work transactions to be done digitally on platforms. And that's where the entire term of gig comes in, where you have tasks that are very short, or you could have certain projects, or you could have work that could be based on hourly time or things like that. So that's where the whole notion of gig economy with the future of work actually has come in. We recently at the ILO produced a report called as the role of digital labor platforms in transforming the world of work, which was published in February 2021, which is a global report, which looks at a number of countries, about 100 countries on online web-based platforms, and about 11 countries on taxi and delivery platforms. Interestingly, there are a number of countries from the Middle East and North Africa region that are part of a survey in both the taxi delivery as well as in the online web-based platforms. So I won't be able to give you a complete stock taking of what it looks like, but I can give you a glimpse into what it looks like in this particular region, actually. So we had looking at just these three elements. There's a lot more other than that. We zero down on online web-based platforms, which are freelance, competitive programming, or microtask work that is done. And we also look at certain location-based platforms like taxi and delivery. They're much more than that. You have telemedicine, teleconsultation platforms. Then you also have care platforms, domestic worker platforms. You have e-commerce platforms. They've all grown in a big way. They've all been trying to create employment opportunities and income opportunities to people. But there are larger questions with regard to what extent do they actually go about doing this? So to start off, one thing I can tell you is that there has been a huge increase in the number of platforms in this region over the past decade. So they were, if you look at 2010 or so, there were very few platforms, say 2 or 3. And today in this region, you have about 54 platforms in just these 3 segments of taxi, delivery, and online web-based. And delivery is what overtakes largely. You have 38 platforms that are there out of the 54 which are in the delivery sector. And to a very large extent, you find that much of these delivery platforms, they originate from United Arab Emirates, and they're spread across not only in this region, but also other regions of the world. But overall, if you compare it with what it looks like to the global scenario, MENA region has only about 7% of the platforms. It's not more than that. While you have other regions of the world like United States, which has about 29%, you have India, the country, having 8%, and United Kingdom having 5% of the platforms. Now, within the taxi platforms, we did find that there were 9 platforms which were quite dominant, and within it, you see that Careem from UAE and Get from Israel are the dominant ones. They actually dominate the entire market in a way. And similarly, in delivery, you do see platforms, though they originate, a lot of them originate in UAE. There are others from Egypt, a very high number come after UAE. And then you have Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and other countries. And on the online web-based platforms, interestingly, there were only 7. And one of the famous ones, which is known world over, is the Fiverr platform, which is very popular both in Europe, Asia Pacific, and other parts of the world. And you find a lot of workers from these different parts of the world actually are participating in these platforms. Now, if you start looking at the investments into these platforms in the region, it's considerably small. It's about just 1 to 2% of the global investments. And interestingly, 96% of the investments on digital platforms are actually located in Northern America, followed by Asia, and then to a small extent in Europe. So there's a very clear digital divide that you see, where not only the platforms, but the investments and the revenues that come by are located elsewhere. And when you start looking at the question of revenue, which is about less than 1% coming out from the Middle East and North Africa region, while you find that 70% of the revenues are actually generated in just 2 countries, that is United States and China. So this is the broad picture for you to look at as to, in the broader picture, where does MENA actually sit? It sits quite a bit, it's a very small share. It's not something that has penetrated in a big way, but you do see that it's coming in. And there's a very clear digital divide that is happening. And within the entire MENA region, I would say the 2 countries that, 2-3 countries where it's a dominant thing is United Arab Emirates, Israel, and Egypt. This is where the concentration is. And Israel is bringing in a number of technologies which are helping a lot of digital labor platforms actually as they go by setting it up. Now, I think there's no doubt about the question that these digital labor platforms are creating income and work opportunities for a lot of workers. And one thing that we have seen within this region is it provides a lot of opportunities for those who are refugees and those who are migrant workers. Depending upon if you're talking about North Africa, it's much more the migrant workers, but if you're talking about much more the Middle East region, you do find a lot of refugees actually engaged in many of these platforms in a big way. And many of these workers on these platforms are young, but then they're not really so young. They're around the age of 35 years. But what is very important to note is that a lot of workers who actually work on these platforms are quite highly educated. This is even so in certain taxi or delivery platforms, which in many countries one would assume that they're not really, it does not require very highly educated skills, but you do find people with graduate or postgraduate degrees actually going and working on these platforms. And especially on online web-based platforms, you find a very large number of highly educated workers working on it. Now, this raises a fundamental question with regard to, why is it so that these platforms have got so much of attraction? And I'll come to that. Before that, I'd just like to make one point more is that in other parts of the world, much more in Europe and North America, what we have seen is that it provides a huge opportunity for women workers. And that is something that we were quite keen on looking at to see to what extent this is so in the MENA region, given the kind of cultural social norms that one lives in. And we found that this was not necessarily so. It was a bit more on online web-based platforms, but not so much on location-based platforms. And even there, I would say it's about 10% of the workforce, not much more than that. So it's completely different compared to what you look at in other parts of the world. Now, the motivation of why people work on these platforms to a very large extent is because of lack of employment opportunities. It's because the labor market, the traditional labor market, is not able to generate employment opportunities that has led many people to actually look for alternatives. And many have been looking at digital labor platforms, sometimes as a stepping stone, but sometimes as only viable option for them to actually work on it, because they, while working on platforms, they also look for jobs elsewhere. And when they don't get it, they continue and try to build up their experience in the hope that, there would be a sort of a career trajectory as they move forward. But we don't really see this sort of a career trajectory happening, even though they are dependent on it, because neither their earnings increase, neither the content of work actually increases. Rather, it's quite interesting that some of the business models, especially in the it's very interesting to see one more thing before I get into some of the challenges that workers face and how they actually try to address it in their own way, in a very innovative way, I would say, which is something we are yet to see in other parts of the world, and we are looking at some of these issues and questions in African and Asian countries today, is that the business model of these platforms. Now, the business model of these platforms actually rely on commission fees. So a very large part of the revenues that they generate is commission fees, and there's other part that they generate using data. So workers, what they have been doing, especially on online web-based platforms, is because 20% of your earnings, or 25, or sometimes even 40% of your earnings is through commission fees, or sometimes, there are payment barriers because certain payment platforms are not allowed within the country. So, to get around that, they have found very innovative ways of working around it. So they use social media. So you have Facebook, you have WhatsApp, you have Instagram, you have LinkedIn. So they use all these channels to get their clients and establish contacts with the clients. And sometimes even the clients who are on these platforms, the clients are able to get in touch with the workers and operate outside it. And this is quite interesting to see. We spoke to a lot of workers from this region, actually, because this is the first thing that got revealed to us, that it's interesting that workers are using these mechanisms to actually get around it. So workers are using this mechanism in a big, big way to get work which are for longer duration. It could be translation, it could be transcription, it could be project management, it could be software development, it could be a whole range of tasks. So they don't go through the platform, but find other means of doing it. While on taxi platforms, and this largely comes from our work in Lebanon, much more than in Morocco, where we have done, is that, it has made people realize that though you talk about this business model, talk about the flexibility of time, place, and where and when you want to work, that flexibility does not really exist when you're talking about pricing. Because the pricing in this business model is actually decided by the platform company that basically matches the supply and demand and decides what the price of a particular ride is going to be, what the price of an order, if it is a delivery worker, or what the price is going to be if there is any work that has to be done on the online web-based platforms. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, we did undertake a post-survey now. And what we found, interestingly, is that a lot of these app-based workers actually shifted back to the traditional mode of driving, largely on the count saying that, well, this doesn't work for us because I cannot dictate my price. And the price that I get through these companies is far lower than what it is. I guess Lebanon is also a special case where there has been a huge issue around the currency. There's been a huge devaluation that has happened. So many of these drivers also would like to shift. While there are these opportunities that are there for refugees, I think that's one issue that comes out very clearly. But again, it's quite interesting to see how the platforms are actually exploiting these workers because they are already vulnerable in a third country and they are seeking jobs for their own survival or whatever mechanism they want to live in. And they are able to see this precarious conditions that these workers are in and are actually using them further to exploit. And I think this is an issue that needs a bit more delving a bit more deeper and trying to understand how they go about doing this and how they are able to survive within these labor markets, considering that some of these economies have very clear regulations with regard to how access to work can be given to many of these workers. So I think that's a larger question to touch upon. But other issues that we have seen coming out from platform work for workers is largely related to a number of challenges. The first challenge that we do see is low earnings. Workers do not earn very high wages, and for about two-thirds of the workers, it's far below the median, which basically speaks volumes about the kind of wages many of these workers earn. And many of them did complain to us saying that they do not find sufficient work or well-paid tasks on these platforms. And this was a case of about 9 out of 10 respondents on online work. And other reason why workers also talk about not having sufficient work is largely because of the digital infrastructure. They do not feel that the digital infrastructure is so good because your internet speed is not very good. You're sometimes able to do the work but not able to upload the files, or there are so much of internet breaks that or electricity breaks that you are not able to keep up with the pace at which the work is demanded. So that was an issue that came up across almost all types of work, because internet and electricity is something super well connected, especially when you're talking about any kind of an online web-based work, whether it is freelance or whether it is micro task works that are actually done. The second issue I have sort of raised is with regard to the commission fees, which is quite high in all of these platforms. And that has led many of these workers, I've said, to move away from doing work on these platforms and finding other ways of going about it. The third thing is the working hours. Now, a lot of workers actually spend a lot of time unpaid looking for work, searching for work, trying to find work so that actually they can do. And this ends up leading to very long working hours, which is often unpredictable. And this has huge impact on the work-family life, but it also has huge impacts on the occupational safety and health, especially when you're talking about taxi and delivery workers. Because, many of these platforms, especially on the taxi and delivery, the way they function is they want to build up their network effects. The more the network effects you have, the higher the price of your company is. And to actually create these network effects, they give a lot of bonuses and incentives. So to get those bonuses, you have to work more than 12 to 13 hours per day. And you find that many of these workers actually work very long hours, so as to be able to get the bonuses, so as to be able to get the higher earnings that they really want to have. And also the entire notion, and you would not get the bonuses if you are not logged online all the time. Because if you refuse work or if you're not online, your chances of getting work are also lower. So there are these algorithmic management practices that are used in a way that gets you into a loop. If you say no to a work, I will not get more work, I'll not get more bonuses, I'll not have a better earnings. I'm caught in a spiral which is at a low end. While if I accept work, then I have to keep accepting because I have to reach that bonus that leads to long working hours, which has impacts on work-time balance, and it can lead to huge occupational health and safety hazards. And many workers did express that also as part of the risks that they actually face while working on it. And another point that I'd like to make is we found, this is not specific to MENA region, this is something specific to all regions too, that there are huge gaps with regard to social security coverage. We found only about 20% of the workers on online web-based platforms having any sort of a coverage or health insurance for the workers, while in taxi and in delivery, it was far lower as far as coverage of any of these factors are. And finally, I'd like to end with saying that, the way the platform economy works and the way digital labor platforms have been advertised with regard to the flexibility and freedom to choose and freedom to work when you want, in reality, it is not the case. To a very large extent, ratings determines whether a worker can have access to a job or even access to a platform. A lower rating often leads to deactivation of workers from these platforms for temporary or even for permanent periods of time. And there's no dispute resolution process that exists in many of these platforms. So, if you have a problem, if your work is rejected, say on a microtask platform, you do not have another human to speak to find out why your work is rejected. You have the algorithm that rejects and rewards the workers. So, this kind of a mechanism has led to a kind of a situation where a worker is now at the mercy of a machine or an algorithm without much human recourse or a solution to actually handle how I can improve my work or how I can continue my work. So I think these are some of the challenges and repercussions of working on digital labor platforms. So I think as long as regulations come in and address some of these challenges, it would not be, it might provide some income opportunity, but it would be at a huge cost to the worker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Uma. This was very, very helpful. I think you raised a lot of profound questions for us. And that will, I think, be the subject of the two subsequent speakers. I encourage anyone in the audience who has questions, write the questions in the Q&A chat section here on Zoom. We'll come back to any questions, remarks, or interventions at the end. But I just felt you also did a good job in setting up the stage for our dear friend, Dr. Hassan Ali, who is a professor and dean of the business school at Nile University. He's been doing a lot of work in labor economics, financial economics, and he's been tasked with dealing with the broad question of informality. Where does informality fit in all of this? What does informality mean in the gig economy? What does informality mean in these platform-based jobs? And can informal labor conditions, or those conditions we tend to associate with informality, the lack of social protection, low wages, add to it now questions about exhaustion, pressure, the fact you're a price taker, you're at the mercy of whoever owns the platform. What room for policy is there, Dr. Hassan? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tariq, and thank you very much, Uma. I think, as Tariq mentioned, you did a great job setting up the ground for what is coming, and I'm very grateful for your presentation. I'm also very grateful for ERF to invite me to talk about a subject that is very dear to my heart, and also to take me out of the administrative dilemma that we are thrown into. I am in Columbus, Ohio. I thought that I will take 2 days off, but I'm up since 2 o'clock in the morning dealing with courses that the provost wants to cancel and the student wants to graduate and all of this mess. So very much thank you to my dear friends in the ARF. The two questions that I have been tasked with, as Professor Tariq mentioned, has to do with the meaning of informality, and also about how technology is going to impact informality. So I'm going to share with you this platform now. I have a bit of presentation here. And the presentation is basically on the same range here. We'll take you step by step, since I used to teach this course for quite a few years. And I used to say to the student, okay, we are in the labor market. And this is before the COVID-19, Tariq, of course. Labor market can be segmented, and you have a prime labor market, and you have a secondary labor market. You have a formal labor market and informal labor. You have quite a few kinds of market, but in terms of formal and informal, and according to my friends in the ILO, the informal, basically all economic activity by worker and economic units that are in law or practice not covered or insufficiently covered by formal arrangement. And the ILO say that about 70% of the workers in the developing economy are in that market, and that percentage reached 90% in sub-Saharan Africa, actually. These are the main characteristics of the informal market. The stability, the informal market is not very stable. Human capital investment is not done there because companies are not going to benefit. And usually in the official market, you have higher compensation. So that's because of the investment that they are basically putting into that market. Now, the promotion and advancement is available in the formal, but not available in the informal. Skills and competency, of course, is much lower in the informal. This is the old-fashioned kind of informality. Right now, we have a new brand. Of course, this is the point that Uma would be very interested in avoiding, that the informal labor market doesn't bring any benefit to the people, whether it is social protection or entitlement, health care, and so on. With this new advancement now in the technology, and we have the fourth industrial revolution, we have a new informal sector. And that's what being called the platform, as Uma mentioned, or what I call myself, I introduced this about 7 years ago, the cloud labor market. You know, I like this term because it gives a sense of lost in the cloud. You know, that's basically what they are. An example of this are being mentioned with some statistics by Uma, but I think a lot of people still in our region don't know a lot of these platforms, and especially the young people. And that's why I'm gonna come to this in the end. Now, the new informal labor market could be more regional and more international. This was not in the old one, right? No, now we have people from the United Arab Emirates are hiring people from Egypt and Jordan in order to work on some platform and adjust them. So I have a student in the engineering school who is actually doing a service to Tesla. This is quite a few example that will make informal market very international in a sense. The informal workers sometimes now are more educated and highly skilled. So again, this is totally different from the old-fashioned informal market. And he might be highly paid, even though it is not highly compensated for their own skills, because usually the company will hire them because they want to lower their cost, right? That's why they don't want to hire some permanent staff. So, but in terms of the opportunity, as Uma mentioned, that's quite well for these people. One of the other things that the informal market is also, and the new informal market, I would say, is also famous for, it's not open-ended, it's quite limited in time, sometimes a couple of weeks, sometimes a couple of days. I actually hired a software engineer from India for 2 days in order to do something in my website at the university. And it's definitely not full-time. And they don't have, of course, a direct subordinate relationship of a formal kind or official kind of market. So the new informal labor market lack some of the legal employment relationship. And this is the one that the ILO is very interested in trying to deal with. Now, the new informal labor market might not be protected by labor legislation. They lack social protection, entitlement such as health insurance, sick leave, holiday, family leaves, all of these might not be there. That's why I like the cloud labor market. You know, they are literally up there. More than that, informality is visible because of the lack of safety and protection against any discrimination or coercion. You know, you are alone with a huge number of people in the same boat. I don't know if, I think I have said this in a couple of interviews, but now we have new agriculture migratory worker. في مصر we say عمال الترحيل. These are the new عمال الترحيل in the labor market. The contrary to the formal labor market, the worker in the informal market is the one who might be investing in himself or herself. You know, just the opposite, in order to broaden, in order to widen their opportunity and promote themselves for advancement. So this is totally opposite of what we have in the official market. This is the dilemma that we are in right now. Yeah, we need the skills, we need the investment in the human capital. Of course, the companies are not going to do that because they can get the best and the brightest from all around the world now, not only from Southeast Asia or the Middle East, for very cheap prices. So the company are reaping the benefit of the individual investment in human capital. And that's another way to look at it. Now, the new informal worker might be engaged, of course, in more than one market, when, you know, talking about the gig economy, and might be engaged in both formal and informal at the same time. So we have the people working for the government or in a private company, but they are also driving Uber at certain number of hours and so on. So this change between the different markets are very loose. You cannot say that this person is in the informal market and sticking to it. He can be fluid between different labor market, whether it's informal or formal for that matter. And inside the informal market, I should have said this in the beginning, there are different grades. So you have the informal labor market and the platform that require very low skill. We're talking about the driving, the catering, food delivery, and all of these things. But in the meantime, we have a different kind of informal market that require a very highly skilled, as I said before. But both of them does require a bit of literacy, digital literacy, so to speak. But inside the informal market, you might have 3 or 4 grades if you want to make the division. So the new informal worker might be more flexible, more mobile, more agile than the traditional one that we used to have. Now, we can say that technology might be able to reduce or manage informality. Technological advancement, provide this platform marketplace or the cloud labor market to allow the effective technology to reach more people and move them from informal to formal sector sometimes. If that happens, good for these people. They need a broadband in order to trade goods, in order to connect to the platform. And this is not very hard to get by right now. Without any massive investment, you can scale and bring economic opportunity to millions of people. There are two specific examples I want to elaborate on them that will bring the idea of using technology to help people in the labor market. And these two examples are going to be explained in detail. But here is just a practical example of how technology helped reduce informality in Kyrgyzstan. They transform the nature and dynamic of the informal social network. So the new technology basically prevented corruption and reduced bribery. This is a major study that has been done in Kyrgyzstan. And it also created a transparent and efficient way to access the public service. Implementing some online payment platform, some accessibility to public service, in addition, of course, to the transparency that will allow the corruption to go down. But here is the one that I would love to talk about because I'm involved in some of these. The fintech. I think the fintech as a technology is having a major role in reaching the financially excluded individual. And not only individual, financially excluded firm give access to finance in the informal economy. The fintech, because of this, what they call financial inclusion principle that has been pursued by all the central banks around the region over here, can really facilitate a lot of movement to reach these people in the informal market, whether by identity verification, whether by promoting digital payment, or by improving the information environment. The Kenyan M-Pesa that happened about 2 decades ago is a very good example of that. And the potential is even higher for the fintech to include more people. Remember that this is one of the major shortcomings in our region. The unbanked people, percentage-wise, one of the least in the world still, with all of the efforts that have been done. When I was working for the African Bank, that's in about 2013, there was only 7% in Africa banked. Can you imagine that? I think now they have reached a percentage above 25%, or maybe higher. I don't have the exact figure, but this is really lifting people. You are giving people access to finance. Again, whether you are talking about firms, whether you are talking about individuals. So more and more, the fintech industry and the fintech startup and the fintech education is very much important in transforming the informal economy. The second one that I am also very interested in, it has to do with, I got the 2 minutes started, is the e-government, right? This is going to also lift a lot of people. There is now e-formality policy. Major study has been done in this area where basically the e-government initiative is going to increase not only productivity, but improve the regulation, design of incentives, improvement of enforcement. So there are more to do about this. To make my point in 2 minutes, I think there are a couple of just suggestion or proposal that we need to use it in order to deal with the new informality. And the ILO should be the champion here, integrated approach of tackling informality. We should not do it one piece mill at a time, but rather with a comprehensive approach where basically we are attacking all points at the same, all sectors and investment in human capital and so on. We also need a new social contract center on the larger investment in human capital. I think this is very important. Last, in terms of practicality, we need something called the digital agent. As I said, a lot of people in our region don't know much about the platform that already exists. They can use it actually. So you need an agent, and the agent here is like a career or an employment center. We take these people, maybe you invest also in their training and their improving of skills, and provide them for the companies, and in the middle, of course, the agent will benefit as well as the informal worker as well. That's it. I think I'm going to stop here so I don't make my friend Tariq scream. Oh.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan. That was a very systematic and rich presentation. I think you helped unpack a lot of issues under the broad banner of informality, the fourth industrial revolution, and the gig economy. So thank you for doing so. In fact, I think you also set the stage for our dear friend Shireen to follow after this. Shireen Al-Azzawi is a lecturer in economics at the Levy School of Business at Santa Clara University. She's a dear friend of many of us at ERF. She's done a lot of work on labor markets, looking at informality, looking at inequality, and she's agreed to take on the question of what do policymakers do about all of this, and perhaps specifically thinking about informality. Is there room for policy reform, policy innovation to help maximize a lot of the benefits that Dr. Hassan has mentioned, and to minimize the costs and the risks that Dr. Omar had noted about the plight of informal workers and informality in general within the scope of the gig economy, the digital economy. So without further ado, Dr. Shireen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tariq, for this introduction, and thank you, Dr. Hassan and Uma, for the excellent informative presentations. I also want to thank ERF for inviting me to take part in this rich dialogue. I'm going to be talking a little bit, or setting the stage maybe, or adding a little bit more to what Uma and Dr. Hassan talked about with regard to the challenges of the informal economy and the future of work, and then talking more about what needs to be done. In terms of the future of work, there are many trends actually that have been going on. It's not just about technology, it's not just about the gig economy, but well before that, the challenges of globalization had already been creating chaos in labor markets around the world, changing the demand for certain types of labor, and creating inequalities and differences in production, distribution, value chains. All of these things have already been going on. But in the last 10 to 15 years, technology and the fourth industrial revolution have really been gaining traction, especially as the pace of automation has expanded. The scope has widened dramatically. There are many technological advances that come to mind when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution. We can think of high-speed mobile internet, AI, widespread adoption of big data analytics and cloud technology. And all of these have huge impacts on labor markets around the world, and of course in the MENA region. Since March of 2020, the whole world fell into the chaos of the pandemic, and almost overnight, most people were shifted to remote work. But then, of course, the ability to do remote work varied dramatically by type of work, by country, by access to technology. This has maybe facilitated or driven the move towards digitalization, towards automation, maybe even faster than it might have been had the pandemic not happened. And in terms of the risks, so the first question that I was asked to talk about, the risks with regard to the future of work, for informality, for workers who are at the lower end of the income distribution. The big question is, will the robots take our jobs? Maybe it's a good idea to step back and talk about what exactly a robot is. A robot is any device or algorithm that does what humans once did. It ranges from mechanical combines and thermostats to something like dishwashers and airfare search sites. So a lot of these things have been around for a long time, and not all of them are bad necessarily. Dishwashers have freed up a lot of time for people to do other more meaningful activities. But there certainly is a difference between robots and just physical capital. Robots can be programmed to perform many tasks. Any task that is routine or repetitive can probably be done much cheaper and more efficiently with fewer mistakes using a robot than using humans. And so this means that the jobs that are most susceptible to automation are jobs that are going to be routine, that can easily be programmed, that don't require a lot of flexibility, a lot of judgment, intuition, creativity, common sense. And a recent study by McKinsey found that between 40 to 50% of all jobs in the countries that they surveyed or that they studied in the Middle East can lend themselves to automation. Now, of course, within this context, there is a very large difference both between countries, but also within countries when we look at specific industries. And let me quickly share a graph here just to show what I mean by that. So within these 6 countries that were studied by McKinsey, if we look at industries, there's a very wide range of automation potential. The size of the bubble in each one of these industries represents the amount of employment that these industries account for. And in many of these countries in the MENA region, the industries that account for the largest number of workers are going to be the ones that are most severely affected, or that will be most prone to the potential for automation. Could be as high as 60 to 70% in manufacturing, for example, 40 to 50% in agriculture. And of course, the alarming or the worrying factor here is that these industries account for the majority of workers, both formal and informal. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there are jobs that are less likely to be automated, jobs in management, in healthcare, in education. And this is good news for anyone who works in these sectors, obviously. But the problem, of course, is that these sectors don't represent a very large percentage of the workers in the region. Looking more at the impact of this on the labor market, and this is data for the United States, we see that the jobs that are most likely to be replaced by robots or by automation are the lowest income jobs. And we know, of course, that in the Middle East and North Africa, these are the most common types of jobs. And so obviously we can expect severe impact on the labor markets as a result of this drive towards cost cutting, higher efficiency, and so on. A couple more graphs just to set the stage. If we divide all jobs into routine versus non-routine jobs, so basically jobs that can be automated or not, and cognitive versus manual work, we see that in the United States, for example, just because the data is more readily available, the only type of work that has really seen significant growth in employment is the non-routine cognitive work. And one more point about this graph, maybe if we zoom in on the period right after the Great Recession, is that during recessions, and of course the last year was a period of dramatic recession as well, many of the manual jobs that are routine and also routine cognitive jobs tend to disappear, and they never tend to come back. In fact, if we look at, again, the United States, just for the sake of comparison, all job growth since 2001 has been in non-routine jobs. And so this is something to keep in mind when we want to talk about the policies that the region is going to have to talk about. I don't want to repeat what Dr. Hassan talked about with regard to informality, but certainly informality is the huge issue that is facing labor markets in the region. Over 86% of young workers, those between the ages of 15 and 24, are informally employed in the region as a whole. Around 60%, sometimes more, of older adults are also informally employed in the region. Of course, this reflects deteriorating working conditions for the younger cohorts. They don't get the same opportunities that their parents and grandparents had. And we also have a lot of research that shows that they tend to be stuck in the informal sector, having a very hard time to graduate or to move out of it once they enter. Over the last year or year and a half, the big question has been who is able to continue to do the work, who is able to continue to work from home or to work remotely. And my own research in this has found that while for the region as a whole, it's relatively low, between 17 to 29% of all jobs could be performed remotely, depending on the country. For informal work or informal workers, the ratio falls to between a quarter and 1/3 of that. Again, depending by country. And for youth, the situation is actually more bleak in some countries. In some countries, youth have the types of jobs that would lend themselves more to remote work, but not in all. Now, what does all of this mean with regard to the impact of the fourth industrial revolution, automation, on reducing informality? Traditionally, reducing informality involves calling for more formal contracts, having social security, healthcare, adding paid leaves. Now, all of this is going to become much more challenging, much more difficult to achieve within the confines of this fourth industrial revolution. Ultimately, it's going to raise costs on the employer. And if at some point the labor productivity is too low to justify using a worker, a machine would be easier to employ, much cheaper, much less of a headache. And so calls for formalization or attempts to increase the decency of jobs are, in my opinion, going to become a lot harder, especially given the kind of fierce competition in the globalized world that we live in. Economies all over the world are going to be trying to maximize their attractiveness and of course, instituting a lot of the laws and regulations that will make jobs more decent and more inclusive, or lead to an inclusive prosperity, is going to be even harder. Now, what are some of the institutional reforms or innovations that are needed to account for these new forms of work, hopefully striking the balance between improving the quality of work and ensuring decent jobs, while at the same time not completely eliminating workers from taking part in this type of growth and prosperity. And I'd say the number one policy has to be around education. It's all about giving the workers the right skills and being open to lifelong learning. So on the one hand, the types of skills that need to be emphasized in our universities and our schools need to go beyond just rote learning, and they need to emphasize critical thinking, problem solving, analytical skills, creativity, adaptability, interpersonal skills, communication, leadership. These are things that are hard to replicate by a machine. And so if we ensure that these are the types of skills that workers have, then the likelihood that they're going to be replaced by machines is obviously a lot lower. This is not an easy task. Can we teach creativity? Can we teach analytical skills or leadership skills? There are ways around it, and it's not easy. Definitely, it's something that's going to require a lot of research and development in actually how to teach these things. But already in many parts of the world, there are programs, there are competitions. My 9-year-old daughter took part in something called Odyssey of the Mind, where they give them what seems like a completely impossible problem and to solve, and they have to figure out a way to solve it as creatively as possible. To be honest, at the beginning, I was completely skeptical, and I didn't think there was any way they were going to solve it. But they did, and sometimes we can be surprised by the ingenuity of the younger generations. Now, one interesting thing that I think we should also keep in mind is that we should try to create a more holistic education system. So, well, technical fields, engineering, mathematics, computer engineering, all of these are important to provide some of the technical side of the skills that the education system needs to provide. It should be combined with liberal arts fields that provide a more in-depth understanding and appreciation of the real world. A lot of these other skills that are not always present in our engineering or our technical curricula. We are going to need to shift our thinking from what we learn to how we learn. I think that's a major question that is, again, not an easy thing to do, but we can Google a lot of things now. We don't need to learn as many of the dates and as many of the events as we might have 20 or 30 years ago, but it's the lifelong aspect of how to acquire knowledge that should be emphasized in our curricula. Of course, this is going to require strong partnerships between governments, the private sector, and educational institutions, so that the curricula that are developed are in line with what these industries are looking for. We are going to need to invest in the development of these curricula, to do a lot of research, to spend a lot of money to come up with the correct dissemination and assessment tools. The second recommendation would be to ensure that there is emphasis on lifelong learning within the industries. There should be incentives to employers to fund and support reskilling initiatives and job training programs. Governments can help by providing tax breaks, wage or social insurance subsidies to encourage these initiatives. Research and development to maximize or to enhance the degree of productivity that is afforded through automation is my third point. And this is something that Darren Acemoglu and his co-authors talked about in the context of the United States. They talked about how productivity has not actually risen fast enough over the last 20 to 30 years to create enough jobs for the future. And that is something that will definitely require a lot of government intervention, research and development funding, research and development support and incentives, so as to maximize the possibility that the automation will result in fast enough productivity to create enough jobs for the future. My fourth point has to do with tax policy. And this is a very sensitive topic. And it's a topic that's going to require a lot of country by country studies and sector by sector studies within these countries. It's going to require a very delicate balance with regard to how much should we tax labor versus technology. Now, technology or automation is going to bring in a lot of cost reductions, a lot of productivity gains, but at the same time, it's going to replace workers. And so there has to be a very balanced approach so as not to make the relative cost of labor too high, which of course would result if we just had a blanket policy of formalization. But at the same time, we also want decent jobs for workers. So there has to be a balance between how much and where to incentivize more automation, where to incentivize more formalization. A strong partnership with the private sector and especially small and medium enterprises, encouragement to digitalize and automate through tax breaks, of course, again, where this is appropriate and where the gains in terms of productivity would outweigh the losses of jobs if there are going to be job losses. Very briefly, I know I'm almost out of time. We can also focus on investing in the IT infrastructure, connectivity, cloud computing, the basic infrastructure that's going to facilitate the ability of firms and individuals to actually take part in this fourth industrial revolution. Of course, as the common recommendation is overhaul the regulatory framework, ensure greater profitability for the private sector, increase competition. All of these are obviously common sense recommendations that will definitely help in this context. And then finally, last but not least, strengthen the national social protection system. There's a need for coverage that doesn't necessarily rely on employment. It's given the nature of work today, it cannot be employment driven. It has to be beyond that. And Tarek is giving me the final, I guess, the red card or maybe the yellow card, I'm not sure. Thank you very much. And sorry to go over time.
Thank you, Shireen. You've packed a lot of very relevant and important material in what was still a very short presentation in terms of time, but very rich in terms of content. Unfortunately, we only have about 11 minutes for the rest of this webinar, and we want to use them as efficiently as possible. And one thing perhaps we could do, I've taken note of some of the questions that have come through. I'll just read out some of the questions, direct them to you. And I'll start with Uma, Dr. Uma, who was asked a question about the benchmark for comparison of jobs. Why are we comparing jobs in the gig economy, the question was, to jobs in the formal sector, as opposed to jobs in the gig economy, to jobs in the informal sector, given that a lot of the gig economy thrives on recruiting and employing workers with conditions or with backgrounds and on terms that more resemble the informal market. That was a question directed to you, Dr. Uma, if you would be so kind as to respond. but also take a minute or two to respond to what you've heard from Dr. Hassan and Dr. Shireen in terms of a broad set of remarks. Please go ahead.
Dr. Tariq, may I just interrupt and bring your attention that you've got two hands raised, Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi and Mr. Hisham Jabi, and I believe they would want the floor. Thank you.
I'm happy to take these questions and then respond together. Thank you, Tariq.
Shireen, we can do that. We can take the questions from the floor or the requests for interventions, and then come back to the panelists for their responses. So perhaps we'll start with Dr. Ibrahim Al-Badawi.
Dr. Ibrahim, you're on mute, yeah, doctor.
Thank you very much, Tariq. It's really extremely stimulating and very profound discussions. I have just two comments and maybe issues for the panelists. Linking actually two aspects of Dr. Hassan's presentation and Dr. Shireen's in terms of that perhaps the flexible type of labor marketplace that requires the workers to reinvent themselves and re-educate themselves on a continuous basis may be the emerging new normal in the context of the Industrial Revolution. And perhaps maybe this should be linked to the educational system that Shireen suggested. And I recall that the MIT Computer Science Department and Economic Department, I think about 2 years ago, 3 years, they created a new degree that actually combined both disciplines. And they presented the case for this degree as that this is now going to be the future of the kind of the skilled labor that will be much more flexible and agile with the emerging needs of the labor market. The other issue, which again I think was raised by Shireen, is the government effectiveness overall. You know, if we a recent study by the World Bank suggested that digitalization of the tax system in Uganda, which is a small economy, in 2 years will actually generate an extra $500 million of tax revenue by addressing issues of tax avoidance and tax evasion. So the requirement for a social welfare system, including actually now what the UN system is calling for, and people like Mahmoud Muhyiddin are suggesting, is the universal social protection in response to these implications for the labor market, requires expanding the fiscal space. And so in some sense, digitalization can be of help in terms of enabling the state to expand the tax system and effectiveness, and therefore being able, allowing governments to be in a better position to respond to the financing needs of the social protection. So I think these are very important issues, perhaps maybe that needs to be further discussed, but I just wanted to underscore these two issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim. And now Dr. Hisham Jabi perhaps will provide his intervention.
Thank you so much. I promise to be very brief. My name is Hisham Jabi. I'm a consultant at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. I am originally from the Middle East, as you can tell from my name. My question is related to the elephant in the room, which is the political economy. And it's how is that related to job creation, and how is that related to informality? I think informality is a symptom for a bigger problem. we all understand that the incumbent and the state-owned enterprises are, I don't know. I mean, they have a role to play. We understand, but it's disaster if we want to really look at the issue from contestability and from scalability and from easy entry to the market and easy exit also to the market. That's That's a critical problem. That's the elephant in the room. And I believe COVID helped a little bit decompose the system in the Middle East. The question to you all is, how much the policymakers sitting in certain position understand that youth bulge is a tsunami? It's not even a wave, it's a real tsunami. 60% of the population are young people. Young people are not looking for jobs. They are looking for dignified jobs. They are looking to be part of bigger things than themselves. It's not like sweeping streets and saying, I have a job. So I think the issue of connecting politics with economy is critical for policymakers because scale matters. We have tens of millions of young people are waiting for a high quality job. So our role is not to create jobs, but to create more and better jobs with a high quality, high end services. It's a paradox, one of many other paradoxes in the Middle East that I can't put my hands around. So that's really my thought. Thank you so much. Very fruitful discussion.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we will, and not to abuse our audience, we will go 5 minutes over the time allocated to us, which gives us about 10 minutes in total. If we divide them efficiently, Dr. Omar will go for 3 minutes, responding to the initial question and subsequent remarks from the floor that came. Then we'll go to Dr. Hassan and finally to Dr. Shireen. So Dr. Omar, 3 minutes, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tariq, and thank you to the participants for this very, very important question. I think it is very important to compare the work in the gig economy with those also in the informal economy, because much of the jobs that are coming into the platform economy were earlier done in the traditional sector by formal workers. So I think that becomes very important and significant to look at. And we have done such an analysis in our report that I shared, where you do find that on certain platforms, certain types of work, controlling for everything, you find workers on the gig economy getting 63% less. Now, we also do some comparison with workers in the informal economy, because if you're talking about delivery workers, but much more, let's talk about the taxi drivers. The taxi drivers in most countries are in the informal economy, and the platforms have come in. The question that comes up is, have they improved the situation? If they have, how have they improved? Have they provided them social protection? Have they provided them continuity of jobs? What have they done? No, they have precarized their work. And we do this comparison in the report. What we do find that in the initial stages, depending upon when the entry of the platform is in the country, there are huge bonuses and subsidies and incentives that are given to the drivers or to the delivery workers to actually capture them within the platform. If you compare at that moment of time, it might look that their prices or the wages are much higher than those of the informal economy, traditional workers. But over a period of time, what we do find is that their earnings are far lower. I think it's the price dynamics that comes in very clearly, and you can see in some countries that there is a shift to going back to informal economy. I think one point I'd like to make, and I do sort of disagree on another point with Professor Hassan, and I'll just say that and conclude. I think one point I'd like to make is that in countries where informal economy is huge, this is not only the Middle East and Northern Africa, but also a number of other developing countries, platforms are basically coming in and exploiting that space. If they would improve the situations of the workers, I don't think it would be a problem. Rather, what is happening is the worsening of the conditions, because the freedom and space that is given for many of these workers is actually not there. This is a point of disagreement I do have with Professor Hassan, where he wanted digital agents to come in and inform about the employment opportunities that are there in the economy. I would be very cautious about that. I think before we sort of try to say that this is the kind of employment opportunities that are there and that should be utilized by the young workers. You need to ensure that these are much well regulated. I think otherwise it becomes very problematic. And I think Shireen did a great job of listing out what these regulatory mechanisms could be. And the final point I'd like to make is what Ibrahim said. If we are talking about flexible types of labor markets to be the new normal, I really worry about that, because if we are going to move towards that, we are pushing all responsibilities onto the worker, nothing on the state, nothing on the firm. Can we rethink and reassess this before we try to push for a flexible type of labor markets as a solution for the kind of employment problems we face in many countries? And thank you so much for having me for this discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Omar, Dr. Hassan. I think I saw that one coming. I would also add to it, perhaps by way of addressing one of the questions that Ibrahim had put on the table, and that is the provision of some sort of a national, universal, perhaps social protection as a way of promoting the sort of outcomes of labor markets that would be consistent with dignity, with decency, and with human development. 3 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Omar, and thank you, Tariq. Let me handle the easy one first. Ibrahim talked about basically the overhaul of the education system. I think that's very important, and I'm not saying something here to plug the institution I'm working with, but we do have a master in business analytics in cooperation with the computer science, and we do have a diploma in big data also with computer science. So this has started, and I think this should be the trend. We have a lot of things to do. We have a boot camp for blockchain. We have huge now projects on fintech. So this has started, Ibrahim, but I think you are 100% correct that this should be the mode rather than the exception. In terms of the education, universal education and lifelong learning, we have been talking about this for a long time, but I think what is more important is the transformative training. I think as a whole, we do need programs done on a massive scale for transformative training that can be really transformative and be basically taking graduate, whether graduate of high school or graduate of college, and give them, as I said, these are boot camp or short-run training to let them know about the tools of the fourth industrial revolutions. There are 7 phenomena being listed in Schwab's book that really people in our country need to know about. All right, in terms of the agency, I think I am, because I am a practitioner in a sense, I know that the government is not going to do a lot in order to invest in the human capital by the degree, the massive degree that we need. So we do need a medium in between, and the medium needs to have some kind of motivations. So if we have a good agent that will basically collect these people, invest in their transformative training, invest in their education in order to make them in a sense more fitting, and to collect also the opportunities that exist, there would be a win-win situation. I am 100% cognizant of what you are worrying about, because I remember I mentioned something about the migratory agriculture worker, Ummal al-Tarahil, and those were examples of exploitation by the agent, so to speak. So I'm very much cognizant of that, but I think we need a form of intermediaries between the market and the workers and the informal sector in order to make them more fitting, and in the meantime, in order to show them the way forward. This can be, again, you need a regulation. We don't have, Ibrahim talked about the fiscal space and so on. And if you talk to people in the street in the region, they will really complain about taxation, complain about what is going on. So we have to have a way, innovative way, in order to make people more, in a sense, productive in that sense. But I sympathize. I know where are you coming from. If we put the good regulation, then we could benefit from this idea. The question by Hisham about the political economy, I think it is always the elephant in the room, and it's always going to be there. I don't think we are able to get rid of it, but as I said, we have to have some motivation for groups or for the private sector to get into the poll and try to find a way for these people to or to give them incentives in order to make the informal sector more productive. I think I'm okay with the 3 minutes, Tarek.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. That was very well done. Last but not least, 3 minutes goes to Dr. Shireen, whom I note also, in addition to the other comments made, seem to have a very sanguine, if not benign, view of technology and put the onus on workers to essentially adjust themselves to maximize the benefits, and perhaps somebody else will have to worry about the risks. Just wanted to note that and to perhaps draw our attention to a recent development in the. I've not abused the time of the panel, so I'm going to do it right now. I think most people have taken note of the fact that the G7 countries have gotten together recently and agreed on common regulations of international tax regimes with the view of maximizing revenues and ensuring they are able to sort of to harmonize. Why not think in terms of regulatory cooperation to bring big techs, especially the big platforms, the trendsetters, the ones who have immense market powers, to abide by certain norms and expectation when it comes to social protection. Now, this might seem fantastical a year or two ago, but look at the US, the recent empowerment of the FTC, and the new drive to bring antitrust regulations to try to do something about the power wielded by big tech companies and the awareness of the immense social ramifications. Just to add this to your 3 minutes, go ahead, Dr. Shireen.
Can I,
Thank you, Dr. Tarek.
Yes.
If you don't mind, Shireen, can I also follow on Tarek's and abuse for half a minute? Because I think the issue of the political economy is so crucial. And Hassan was saying something, Dr. Hassan was saying something about the compliance with effort of taxation. I just wanted to highlight a point raised by Shanta Devarajan from Georgetown, a former World Bank. He's developed a very interesting political economy model, linking actually kind of completing the loop, linking cash transfers and family support to the ability or perhaps the possibility of the government moving from the bad equilibrium in terms of the perception of people, that we pay taxes to governments that are irresponsible or corrupt, and therefore even if we have to keep our money at the expense of limited public goods, we prefer that. You know, the barometer actually data in Africa and the Middle East showed that in a very clear way. So he's suggesting that perhaps the government could actually signal its commitment by adopting this cash transfer or universal, social protection as an instrument to signal its commitment and therefore, gain some credibility. It's a very interesting idea. Of course, it needs to be further thought about, but this is another dimension that I think would be interesting to inject in the discussion. Thank you.
Now even less
Thank
time.
you, Dr. Ibrahim. Yeah, so hopefully I will get my 3 minutes now. So thank you, Dr. Ibrahim, and thank you everyone for your interventions. And just to start with Tariq's point about the benign impact of automation or the fourth industrial revolution, I don't think we really have a choice at this point. The train has already left the station, and we either catch up with it or we get left behind. And in everything that I mentioned, I did talk a lot about the very strong role of government in facilitating curriculum innovation, in facilitating lifelong learning, and providing incentives for firms and for individuals to learn new skills and to go back to school and learn the kind of skills that would help them take advantage of this new type of technology and new type of work. And as Dr. Ibrahim and Tariq also mentioned, there's a lot of room for an international integrated tax policy here, and by extension, social protection policy that can use or will require this type of international tax policy. And at this point, we really have few choices in terms of what private individuals can do other than to upskill, to reskill, while governments, businesses, they are the ones that are going to have to come up with the funding. And at the same time, the capital here is going to have to be taxed as much or sometimes even more than labor in order to create this balance between hiring workers and going for the machine. So a lot of work has to go into studying what is the ideal balance that needs to be achieved, but it is something that we really have to deal with rather than, do we have a choice of automating or not? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shireen, for sticking to the 3 minutes. On behalf of my colleagues at ERF, I want to thank the panelists for really enriching the discussion today, as Ibrahim noted, providing a set of very stimulating ideas that will start, hopefully, a debate, and a debate that will continue as we learn more about the state of the regional economy in the post-COVID-19 era. This is a stock-taking exercise, a research agenda type of a discussion today. I look forward, like many of you, to ERF assuming a leadership role as it has on so many issues in the past, in advancing this agenda, advancing the policy questions, and helping to refine the recommendations to policymakers on how to best maximize the opportunities and minimize the risks. I think we've had a very productive 1 hour and 45 minutes. I want to thank all of you, especially the panelists, for making this possible. From my side, I want to thank ERF for organizing it, and would like to hand over the mic back to Shireen, if she's still there. Shireen?
Absolutely. I'll just join you in heartfelt appreciation for a very rich session, and thank each and every one of the panelists. We're really grateful, and invite you to join us in about 15 minutes, should you wish, to our next panel on demography and labor market with Dr. Zafiris Thanos, with Dr. Nader Qabbani, Dr. Raghi Asad, Dr. Caroline Kraft, and Dr. Ghada Barsoum for another very exciting session, and the final session tomorrow on inequality. And with that, I really, really, really thank you all for a very rich discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.